welcome to Comic Books and You. Today we're going to go over Bob Morane Yang equals Yin, which is a 2000 comic, or never pre-published in any magazines or any other publication. The original novel, from what I gather, dates from 1996, so it's a fairly late Bob Morane story in the grand scheme of things. But even though it's a late addition to the mythos, it's still a very good introductory book. In this story, Robert Moran is represented as his simplest possible role. He's just a journalist for a magazine Le Reflet on an assignment in San Francisco. So nothing special, fancy, no outside tools, no special powers or anything in this special particular story. It could happen at any time where Chinatown exists. There's no real requirement for the character or ourselves to understand it. We do see him being skilled at combat, including firearms, martial arts, weapons usage, and we do see his quality as a stunt car driver, more or less, but we don't see the majority of his other amazing skills. The fact that he can see in the dark really well probably helped him throughout the story, but it's never brought up and never an important key character. As I was saying, this is as basic as can get. And you could probably replace Bob with just about any other pulp hero in this kind of story, since it doesn't require anything special from him. It just features him in this case, in a way. Another one of our important character is Alan Lee Young, who's a leader of the Triads in San Francisco's Chinatown, who's wheelchair bound. He's the grandfather of Sarah Lee Young, which is about the only female character you're going to see in this book. And she's a woman who rescues and helps Bob a little bit throughout the story. We don't know the extent of his criminal enterprises, but as a triad leader, racketeering, probably the most common thing. But if you look at historically, the triads deal, well, racketeering, prostitution, drug, all sorts of other things. But Alan Lee Yan is represented as a good guy through most of it, the representation of the yang in yin and yang. A bit of an odd character. We don't get too many details about him. Another man which is fairly important in this story is John Dumbril. I'm not sure how you're supposed to pronounce that. He's a mysterious blonde Occidental man who is in Li Yang's entourage. We learn later on that he's a member of the UK Secret Services, MI5 or MI6, either or. And his role is to infiltrate the triads to find out what their role would be in a future post-socialist China. We learn that he is a crack shot with a sniper rifle, but he also prefers smaller caliber pistols, favorite being a 38, which is a very reasonable weapon. So the story starts as Bob is on an assignment in San Francisco for Magazine Le Reflet. Nothing special. We're not told what the actual assignment is. We don't really need to know either. It's just part of what's going on. And right before an earthquake hit, we have the image of the earthquake at the bottom. He gets a call from a Chinese antiquarian that he dealt with in the past, Mr. Wei, and he offers him a fairly good deal on a Chinese artifact. And Bob decides that he might want to purchase it. Since he has to work during the day, obviously, he goes to Chinatown in the evening. There's a torrential downpour and construction all over the place. So he must be either in San Francisco or Quebec, one of the two. He goes to the store. It's not exactly where he remembers it to be because of how confusing San Fran's Chinatown is. He enters the shop, calls for his friend a little bit, gets no response, goes to the back store and finds him laying on the ground, dying of being poisoned. Mr. Wei gives him instructions to meet with Li Yang and to be careful around Yin. Not much more information than that, and he gets a piece of paper with half of the yin yang symbol on it. Bob tries to call the cops because there's a debt there, but the phone line is cut. He tries to leave the house, but he notices very quickly that a group of Chinese hatchet men, which are a bit anachronistic here, but generic triad tugs or tongs would be another term to use for those. They surround the store, grabs a guandao from the wall, and he fights off the first few men that are trying to break into the store. And Bob escapes by jumping off the roof. He jumps off the roof, jumps down to the ground. Pursuers are still after him. But a sports car, I'm not quite sure of the make and model here, but it is a sports car, crashes into the hatchetmen. And Sarah Lee Yang opens the door and lets Bob in and drives him back to his hotel. Not much more is given at this point because neither of them seem to want to open up to each other in terms of what is going on. The next morning, Bob is strongly invited by a few armed gentlemen to come and visit Alan Lee Yang, and where he meets with the triad leader, with his granddaughter, and gets a few details. Dumbril stays in the background and doesn't say anything for most of the meeting. Bob explains basically what happened the previous night, and Li Yang says that he sent his granddaughter to meet with Mr. Wei because he was scared for him. Fat Ing, which is the other nickname for Alan, quickly explains to Bob the yin yang symbol and its relation with good and evil, yang being good, yin being evil. It's a very basic explanation of the symbol and the symbology of the Taiji. But in this particular story, it's all you really need. Bob decides to not really get any more involved in what is going on and leaves the Triad Hideout, which is an old hotel, even though Dumbrill tells him that what if helping us find out what's going on would save the world. Bob basically says, I've had enough of saving the world. Bob goes on a floating restaurant for dinner, and he gets a message telling him not to interfere in Chinese affair by a Chicano waiter before he can try to find that particular waiter. Bob does not notice Dumbrill running away from the scene, catches him, and starts trying to interrogate him. They do get into a bit of a scuffle, but nothing terrible. They sit down together and have a bit of a chat. Fat Ing told the Brit to follow Bob and report his findings without much more information, and the two decide to go back to the Triad Hideout to go and ask questions to Fat Ing. They get there. Sarah tells them to leave and take the first plane to Paris rather than talk to her grandfather, who is in a bad mood. They go upstairs and they find one of the bodyguards dead and Fat Ing gone, his wheelchair toppled on the ground. Dunrill knows of a secret passage that can be used to escape the hotel unseen, so they go through the various tunnels beneath Chinatown, try to figure out what's going on. They really find nothing particular, and they have some doubt as to how Alan Li Yang got out of it, since there's a bunch of stairs, there's a bunch of anything, so someone who should have carried them around, which would have been fairly difficult. They have more questions coming out than they had coming in. They go back to the hotel, which they find completely abandoned, and a fire breaks out, destroying the place. Bob and Dumbrill are separated, and Bob barely escapes with his life. The next morning, Bob gets a call from his good buddy director Herbert Gaines at the CIA. Always good to have a friend in high places at the CIA. It's very safe. They give him a quick resume of the situation, and after a little bit of talk, Gaines tells him that the Triad have plans for post-socialist China, and he asks Bob, promise that he won't interfere, and Bob does it in all honesty. I mean, he promises that there won't be any more interference. The intrepid journalist goes back to Mr. Wei to figure out what was going on a little bit more and go look at the antique he was supposed to get. As he starts touching it and trying to figure out if there's anything weird or wrong with it, he is interrupted by an assassin. Bob trounces him, and then after he wakes up from his knockout, Bob interrogates him really quickly. The assassin says that he's just a thief, even though he has the yin symbol on his chest, making it very obvious that he is a triad Tong. But as the interrogation goes on, the San Andreas fault line strikes again. There's another fairly big earthquake. The assassin takes advantage of it, kicks the weapon out of Bob's hand, and runs away. Bob brings the antique back to his room, and he starts looking at it, and he notices that one part of the sheen on it is off, and pulls it off, and finds the message yang equals yin on a small piece of, it seems to be metal, and he's not quite sure what to take of that, as Dumbril calls him and gives him instructions for a secret rendezvous outside of town, closer to San Diego. Bob does trust the man enough to go to the meeting, which is outside of disaffected gold mine. After they meet, Dumbril tells him that he's a member of the intelligence community for the UK, and is trying to find out more about the Triads, and once again what their role would be in a post-communist China. He knows that there's a Triad leadership meeting for the Yin organization nearby in a nearby hacienda, and he believes that's where the two Li Yang's Alan Li Yang and Sarah Li Yang are held captive, so they can try to go and rescue them. They disguise themselves as Chinese, to not much avail. I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have passed any scrutiny. And they grab various weapons, a 38, a German-made sniper rifle, and Bob getting a Desert Eagle, and they get ready to go to that hacienda to take part in the meeting and try to figure out what they can do to rescue the other two. As they use the sniper rifle as a scope to see what's going on and try to scout out the area, they finally learn that Fat Ing Alan Li Yang is actually Mr. Yin, who's the leader of the evil triad, and the tongues under his control, the various hatchet men that we see down there, are calling out for revolution in China and a reestablishment of the monarchy and the Chinese empire. In order to get that underway, they plan to sacrifice Sarah Li Yang and then start a revolution in San Francisco. Bob takes action to try to infiltrate the meeting. He runs to the side and knocks a guard out by throwing a rock at him to try to not attract too much attention. As he gets inside and tries to rescue Sarah, Dumbril asks to shoot Yin/Yang in the chest to knock him out before he stabs the young woman, and Bob rescues her. Of course, the tongs are to chase him. Luckily, Dumbril is a crack shot with a sniper rifle, so he provides cover fire. They run all the way back to him. Dumbril gives his Jeep keys to Bob since he is a better driver. I mean, it's pretty easy to know that an international adventurer is probably the better driver, shooter, action man than you are, even though you are a spy. I would agree with that normally. And they go off. Of course, it's pretty hard to go off when there's a huge mob of triad soldiers around. They get into a pretty nasty car chase where they keep getting shot at and all sorts of cars start rolling around. It's a pretty nice scene overall. A couple of good page of action with few dialogues. Not something you would see very often in American comic, where this would be minimized most of the time. So as the pursuant get closer to them, I mean, they're a little bit better off-road once they get to the road. The others are, the pursuant are generally more in cars, so they get closer and closer. And in the end, one of their tires gets shot out, and they're going to get caught up by the triad soldiers. But they manage to get to the end of a bridge just as another earthquake hits and destroys the bridge and at least two of the pursuers' cars, basically saving their lives. Might seem like an odd coincidence, but we've had earthquakes throughout this story already. So it's just a proper usage of Chekhov's gun, if you ask me. At that point, Sarah explains that her mother was adopted by Yang, and that most of what was going on here was her actually working for the Chinese government to investigate Yang as well. So this was a huge spy operation that ended fairly abruptly because of bad luck by everyone in a way. The next day, after getting a call to the CIA and MI5 and everybody, the FBI goes to investigate the hacienda, and they find no traces of anything having happened there, and they don't find any bodies either. So we're not sure if Yang is still alive. As I said, it is a pretty simple story overall. It's a detective thriller slash spy thriller that doesn't require any foreknowledge or anything fancy. It works perfectly well on its own. The cover itself for this is simple and effective. We've got our main character in the center, we've got the yin yang symbol in the back, we've got Sarah in his arms being rescued. So, aesthetically, very good. It draws attention fairly easily. It doesn't have strong background work, it doesn't have anything super attractive as a cover outside of we know what's going to happen in this story. This is the cover that they chose for Integral number 15. And I'm not sure it's the one I would have used. I would have used one of the other stories in it as the cover. It was more relevant and more attractive in a way. It's not a terrible cover, but sort of weak in my opinion. This particular story comes from Integral 15. I think there's 18 Integral that came out at this point. It's a book that contains 6 stories, 42 to 47 pages long. So it's still a fairly thick book, but the quality is really good on this one. Extremely nice art cover. The pages are standard fare for Franco-Belgian comics. Nothing super fancy there, but the binding is really good. Even if you keep reading it and keep opening it, it doesn't have any massive strain or damage coming up to it. It is better than the Yokotsuno Integral, which I had to deal with earlier, which had a much weaker binding. The other Integral I had to deal with, I haven't done any reviews on them, were the Valérian and Laureline Integral, who were kind of the same quality as this one. It's a heavy hardcover, however. I mean, compared to the small cardboard hardcover that you have for DC and Marvel, this one here you could probably smack someone with that book and you'd cause real damage. I personally like those Integral a lot more than omnibuses that you have from American comics. The $100 or $200 hyper book that are so massive that you actually need a lectern in order to properly read them. And whenever you open it, you're worried that the binding is going to bust open. It's not a very compelling thing to do unless you just want to say, I have X, Y, and Z omnibus, or it's a character that has, 3 stories. It would be much better to have smaller compilations like this one, $40 to $50, reasonably priced, 240 pages or so, maybe a little bit more, but 240 would be enough. A better release schedule. The trade paperbacks kind of work, but they're not meant to be like those Integral. Integral are really there to give you the entire work properly split. It would be nice to have that for older books. I'd really want to read the first stories of Doom Patrol, second story of Doom Patrol, Volume 1, Volume 2. But it's almost impossible to get the entire comic run, and it's very hard to get all the compilations they've done because they just don't publish them anymore. Kind of annoying. For this particular Integral, what I don't like compared to the Yokotsuno or Valérian Integral that I've seen, no editor notes, no commentaries, no details on how the story was written or why it was written. It just has the stories themselves. I would have taken one less book out of the Integral to have 2, 3, 4 pages at the start of every story with some production details. It would help making those videos, and it would give us some context as to what is going on. Artistic merits on this book. Korea's only done a few Bob Morane book, only 49 over the years. I'm pretty sure this is as good as it's going to get for him. I don't see him improving even in later volumes. This is the style that I know and that I've seen forever. It's Vance's style, copied by Korea, and that's been improved just a little bit over the years. There's nothing super modern about what you're going to see here, but it is a pretty good work overall. Character art is great. Every character is different. and you can easily identify them, including the minor tugs. They're well defined, they have their specific look and shape to them. As such, it works fairly well as a work. Every proportion is perfectly fine. This is a very realistic kind of look. We don't fall into caricature for the foreign types here either. The Chinese are represented very politely, let's say, which is not always the case in these types of stories and these types of pulp stories. Sometimes it's very one-sided, fairly, no, I don't want to say racist, because often enough it's not racism that drives these kinds of action. More a case of not knowing the culture well enough, or just wanting to lean into those caricatures because it's easier for you to do as an artist. Facial expression, once again, varied and well done overall. We've got stoicism is probably the most common one that you're going to see on a lot of the characters, but you've got some playfulness, you've got some surprise, you've got what you need, and it's really easy to identify what emotions our characters are going through. The coloring could be viewed as a little bit weaker at time because we've got a lot of those black and whitish or very gray tone kind of panels. But even here during the torrential downpour in an evening in Chinatown, you do have just enough color to realize that it is the night, and you just have those street lights and those little bit of light that gives you what gives you a bit of color. It's a very nice attention to detail. The background work in this, well, like most of Korea and Vance's work, is fairly phenomenal. That's the best way to saying it. Very realistic backgrounds that have strong composition. We're going to see here an antiquarian, a bunch of antiques in the back in various tones, the shadow work being really nice. This particular shot doesn't have creases and cracks in the walls that you have in some other places. There's that bit of attention to detail in these that are really strong and show that the backgrounds are there to make the story look a lot better, and not just as something you throw together because your characters are in front of them. Very realistic background, as I keep it said. Small deformation in the wall. The building shot here in the San Fran skyline is really, really nice. It's not the best I've ever seen because I've seen Akira. This here does show a very good understanding of composition, of lighting as well. It's very, very good in my opinion. All the art in this is done by Koryo and his studio assistants, including the coloring, including the lettering. Everything is done, well, in-house. So basically the script is done by Henri Verne. He also is the one doing the page layout, from what I understood from their work. And then Corio was like, okay, well, here I'm going to do this, this, and this. And everything was done in house for them. Panel work is weaker. I mean, it's very traditional 60s, 70s style comic, just what Coria and Verne learned from originally. It's an art style that they learned from William Vance. Any previous artists that they had, they also worked with them. Henri Verne was very traditional in terms of how he wrote those books. So it's not too surprising that we don't have anything really fancy in terms of panel work. It's the panels change size, the panels are a bit adjusted, but we don't have weird full play splashes. We don't have bleeding panels. We don't have anything that is truly surprising. As far as story element goes, well, why are so many Franco-Belgian heroes journalists, Tintin, Superman, if you go in American comic as well? Well, journalists used to have a really good reputation searching for the truth and searching for knowledge. So they had that reputation, and it does give them the advantage of being able to travel the world, have tons of contacts, and everything along those lines. It's very different than current day journalists who are not as fun to talk about and don't have the same level of integrity. And even in stories where those journalists the new journalists are supposed to be the good guys, I read through them and I don't have the same adventurous feeling that I get when I go through Bob Morane or Original Tintin, anything along those lines. New York is the largest Chinatown in the world nowadays, but when this story was written, it was San Francisco. That was the biggest one. It's kind of reflected in the story as the big international hub of Chinese people, which was San Francisco at the time. There's a weird failure from Henri Verne here where he used the terms hatchet man instead of hatchet man to represent the tongs that are chasing Bob. Basically, hatchet man were the handyman and the general low-level thugs that were used by the triads during the Tong Wars, which were mostly in the 19th and early 20th century. Someone who keeps reading on Bob Morane will realize fairly quickly that Chinese and Eastern influences are fairly common within it, and that kind of comes from his early 20th century experience where he basically left his native Belgium to gallivant around the world with a Chinese woman in his youth, traveling all over the place and ending up in China. So those kind of understanding that how the triads worked and everything, which is sort of repeated in many of the stories, kind of comes from that period where he was dealing with this seedy underground of the Chinese people around the world and in China as well. So that's a bit interesting when thinking about it. For once, the CIA is not represented as an horrible, corrupt monster with no morals. Bob's friend, Herbert Gaines, sometimes is on the bad side of deals in those stories, but generally more as a, well, this happened, can you help me out? Here, he's really trying to get with Bob and tell him to be careful, not to interfere with things that he shouldn't be messing with. But once the problems do come up, he gets in contact with Dumbrill to get in contact with Bob, provides them with equipment. The CIA here is not represented as a bad guy, which is fun because that's a very common trope nowadays. Another interesting thing is the fall of socialism in China. This book was originally written in 1996 after the fall of the Soviet Russia, America having won the Cold War, before the War on Terror of the 2000s. So this was a thing that was probably fairly commonly talked about at the time. I don't remember it. I was too young. I was 12 years old or so when that book came out and wasn't a big subject of conversation, but in international circles, expecting China to open up a lot more must have been in the cards at the time. The way they opened up compared to the fall of socialism, however, is a big case of discussion. I would still expect the triads to have quite a bit of an hand in things in China, especially after the opening of the borders. Who knows if that's very representative or not? I do wonder, and I certainly doubt, that there's a major movement amongst those triads to bring back the imperial Chinese system. But it sounds cool in a book. Sounds cool as an idea for a bad guy. Who knows if it reflects anything in real life? But it does give Yin a good motivation, and you can reuse him as a bad guy with that motivation in further stories if required. So, an interesting concept. You're going to have people nitpicking about Bob Morane and the odd coincidences that keep happening in those stories. This is perfectly fine. Honestly, I do sometimes wonder how lucky Bob can get. But you have to notice when you go through those books that those odd coincidences are always foreshadowed. I mean, from the start of the book, we've got earthquakes in this particular book. We've got one at the very start, one when he's fighting a triad assassin, and the final one which saves their lives. So it's a Chekhov's gun that's properly used, something that we see once, twice, and then is used to end the story. And we do get in the story a little bit of info as to, well, they're expecting multiple major earthquakes in after the first one. So all of that is keeps being recalled. Amazing luck by the character, also not super unusual when dealing with pulp characters. Read Conan, you will notice that Conan is amazingly lucky as well. Here we have the final earthquake that collapses the bridge. Things move very quickly in this book. Like in most Bob Morane comic, I mean, you're translating a 250 pages pocket-sized book into 42 to 47 pages. Using the standard metric of conversion for this here, this is closer to the mini graphic novels, the One Bad Days we've already reviewed, The Vengeance of Bane, Seduction of the Gun, which I haven't done my review on, I would need to go at some point and do. Those larger books that you get from DC every once in a while, things move fast, but they don't move fast enough that you're lost in the pacing. Everything is well done, that you get a feeling for the characters, you get a feeling for the situations, and you get that nice car chase at the end when they go through the tunnels. You get about 2 pages of just them, Dumbrill and Bob, looking around the tunnels, trying to figure out what's going on. So it moves fast, but not too fast either. Obviously, if you read a lot of Bob Morane comics, you will get the beat on how those comics are written and how those comics keep working. This is something that you can grab off the rack as well. So you could, let's say, go to your store, grab Yang again equals Yin, read it, it's fine. And then 3 months later, you go back to the store and you buy any other Bob Morane book off the rack, read it, and you're fine. And once you read a few of them, you'll figure out kind of how the pacing works in them. So fairly interesting overall. As I was saying, this is a great introductory story for Bob Morane, even though it's the 68th graphic novel published overall. It's got everything that makes Bob Morane Bob Morane. You don't need foreknowledge, preconceptions, or anything. You could literally, like I said, grab this off the rack and read it, and it would be a fairly interesting story overall. Anyone can read this and find enjoyment. Kids, teenagers, adults, grandparents. It's completely timeless. There's things like weapons and cars that's going to date it. All that we really need to know is that this story happens anytime after the rise of Chinese communism, so after World War II. You could replace any of the cars with any car from that period, and it would work fairly well. The only thing you don't really see a whole lot of is really modern technology, modern computers, modern cell phones, things like that you don't have in this story, which manages to keep this story timeless and far more interesting, in my opinion. We don't have any social messages or deep and profound questions about life in this. It's do what's right, crime is wrong, and help those in need. That's all you really need in that book, and what should be in most books nowadays, rather than trying to push a particular message. I do think these types of self contained story are far more interesting and far more refreshing nowadays. Sequential storytelling has been a big thing since the 90s, really. And we've lost those episodic format, which we used to have in things like Star Trek and those pulp novels and those pulp series. So you get those super long story arcs and story arcs that build into other story arcs. And you kind of lose some of the characters and you lose some of the mystique of what's going on. And it leads to things like people talking around the dinner table because you don't know how to move your story forward. So I do think these pulp style stories are more interesting for the casual reader, and even for a big comic reader they are much simpler to deal with than having to say, like, okay, well, what issue do I need to start buying from in order to understand what's going on? So this covers this particular book. I hope you guys have a very nice rest of your day. Keep on reading comics, keep on enjoying them. I'll keep analyzing them, and I'll see you guys later. Bye bye.